Welcome. You're listening to Latin Waves with your hosts, Sylvia and Stuart Richardson. Latin Waves is more than just hot rhythms. This is a show about community, about creating a culture that is inclusive and based on fairness. Because everyone deserves dignity, respect, and has something to contribute. A new world is possible, and it all starts with us. I'm delighted this morning to be joined by Ellen Brown. She's the author of Web of Debt, The Shocking Truth About Our Money System and How We Can Break It. She has written so many articles on the economic downturns and the crisis. Her latest article is about the GameStop short squeeze. So we're delighted to have you. Thank you again for being with us, Ellen.
Always good to talk to you. Thanks, Sylvia.
Thank you. Now, most people during COVID have been either feeling completely isolated and depressed, and many have taken to new hobbies and things that to keep them entertained. So, can you take us? Introduce to our audience who don't understand what GameStop is or how this came about. This video game store called GameStop became all the rave in the news. Tell the story of why this story is so important to our society and to people who are interested in creating a world with more equity and justice for people.
Mm-hmm. Well, it was a group of a subgroup of Reddit, the social media Reddit, called Wall Street Bets. And they're largely young people and giving each other advice about the stock market, et cetera. And the young people, or people in general, have had a whole year off now to study up on such things. So it used to be that the little guy, as some people call them, couldn't compete against Wall Street or the Wall Street cartel. It's definitely a cartel. I mean, they act together. They act as, I saw that even Elizabeth Warren called it insiders versus outsiders. She said that at one point she was given the option of being an insider or an outsider, but if you're an insider, you don't criticize the other insiders. They all stick together and they all support what the others do. If you're an outsider, you can poke at them, but you're an outsider. You don't get to play their game. This subreddit group had over 2 million people in it, largely young people who were just learning the ropes of investing. Of course, everybody's quite aggrieved about how these over 100,000 small companies have been put out of business due to the shutdowns, the lockdowns. So millions of people are out of work and don't have incomes, and meanwhile they're watching the stock market be propped up by the Federal Reserve, and it just keeps the big players are making money and the little guys are losing hand over fist. So obviously not fair, but this was a chance for them to actually make their mark. It's been called, some people are calling it Occupy 2.0, or there was a group of young Republicans in New York. They were all young people, and they were protesting. I'll get to that later. But anyway, they were calling it Reoccupy Wall Street. So in the Occupy movement in 2010, you had all these young people that were camped out in the park out in front of the Wall Street big entities, but they didn't really have an effect other than raising a lot of awareness about what was really going on and who was really at fault with the 2008 collapse, that it was really the banks themselves that were at fault, the ones that were getting bailed out. But so they raised awareness, but they didn't really occupy Wall Street. But now these young people have they're actually playing the game and winning at it. And the reason they're able to win is because they've consolidated their power. It used to be like if you wanted to buy one share of Tesla or whatever, I don't know what Tesla is at right now, but it's quite expensive and you had to buy a whole share. And so they didn't even have the money to buy whole shares. Um, and they didn't have the knowledge, of course, and they didn't have the time to do it. They're busy at work all day, and they come home tired, and they've got to do the laundry or whatever. They have to, just the ordinary upkeep of the family. You don't have time to get together and compete. So that's what the last year has done. And another point is that these young people are skilled at computers and gaming, and that's what they know. That's what they do. They know algorithms. They know numbers, so they can get into reading these charts and figuring out what's really going on.
I just wanted to point out that, the 2010 Occupy movement did not come as a surprise because capitalism's cyclical crisis is, something that we've been told is just normal, it's part of the economy. But no one explains to you how the economy has functioned, who gets the right to print money, how does, Wall Street get revamped in a time of pandemic when businesses are going out of business, and how the federal government is pumping them so they stay afloat. So I think of this as a populist uprising, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the significance, because in your article you point out that there has been many other movements against this kind of 1% rule over the economic wealth of the country, and how this not only signals to what a beautiful writer you quoted, Mary Elizabeth, declared late in 1890. She said, "The Wall Street owns the country. It is no longer a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, but a government of Wall Street, by Wall Street, and for Wall Street. The common people of this country are slaves, and monopoly is the master." I wonder if you could talk a little bit about why you quoted her and why this is so important for us to understand.
Actually, our whole country has been the history of attempting to break free of not necessarily Wall Street, but the big bankers in general, or the big financial interests, or the big cartel. So originally, we were enslaved by London bankers, by England in general. We were supposed to be just like Canada and like all the other colonies. We were all supposed to be, working for England, and so the American colonists figured out how to print their own money. They didn't have money. They didn't have gold, and they had some silver, but not really enough. So they figured out to print their own paper money, and then the King of England forbade them to do that. And according to some authorities, that's what actually triggered the American Revolution. It was a revolt against that. Suddenly, the American colonists were no longer having a medium of exchange. They were suddenly in a depression, and so they revolted, and we had the American Revolution. And then during the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln was going to have to borrow at 30% interest, more or less, from the London bankers. And so he went back to doing what the American colonists had done, which was to print his own money, the greenbacks, the U.S. notes, as opposed to what we have now, our Federal Reserve notes. And of course, then Lincoln was shot, and we went through another depression. And in the 1890s, we were in a quite serious depression, and there was the populist movement of the 1890s. And that's when my book you mentioned, Web of Debt, that I was using that whole populist movement as a theme. It was the theme of The Wizard of Oz. The first ever march on Washington was a group of populists, or a group of out-of-work factory workers and farmers who literally marched all the way from Ohio to Washington, D.C. to try to get the government to go back to doing what Lincoln did, which was to issue our own greenbacks or U.S. notes, and to use that money to fund various infrastructure programs and social programs that were necessary. And of course, they were defeated, but that was when Mary Elizabeth Lease, when she made that speech, that was part of that whole movement. And then what, of course, the thing I do now all the time is public banking. And that was triggered by the Bank of North Dakota, which was set up in 1919 by another populist group, the Nonpartisan League of North Dakota. Of course, it was local, it was just there in the state, but it was still part of that movement, that populist attempt to break away from the bankers, the big out of state bankers that were foreclosing on the North Dakota farmers' farms, and they could see that it wasn't fair. They weren't taking their grains when the grains were good, and the granary and the banks and the railroad were all one cartel. So they set up their own granary and set up their own bank, and now it's just this stellar model of what you can do with a public bank because they're actually very profitable. And North Dakota came through the 2008 crisis. That's why I started writing about the Bank of North Dakota. They were the only state that didn't go into the red during that crisis. Of course, I guess there were other reasons as well, but the Bank of North Dakota was a major factor in that. And so now we have we're still fighting the same cartel. It's we had the Federal Reserve Act of passed in 1912, and the populist candidate in the 1890s was William Jennings Bryan, and he was actually the opposition to the Federal Reserve Act. He thought it was so obscurely worded that it looked like the populists were getting what they wanted, which was government issued money. But of course, it's actually Federal Reserve issued money, which is not just handed over to the government, but is lent to the government. And originally, it was at interest that was paid to the Federal Reserve. I mean, later that was changed. So now the Fed rebates the interest to the federal government. But of course, the Fed does not hold most of the bonds. Most of the bonds are, or at least half the bonds, are held by private institutions and private people. And they do get the interest.
I love that you point that out, and thank you for taking us to such a thorough history. Um, One of the things that really strikes me is that most average people, like you said, are too busy trying to meet their daily needs, and they don't pay attention to how markets function and whether the market's up or down. They just know that their factory where they work has just been closed, and or that they're being called back to work. So to us, the idea of the market is the place that self-regulate, right? Or so we've been told. The market figures it out. But one thing that we've never known is that this poker game that they play behind doors is that they bet on things to either cause them to collapse and die out, and so someone will profit from that loss. From the point of the market, if the U.S. declares war on another country, investing in weapons and that will yield some heights, right? So it makes sense to kill, I guess. Even death can be a form of generating an increase in funds. So can you explain to us what exactly is the short squeeze?
GameStop was the company that sparked all this furor. Although there were some other smaller companies like AMC, which is the theaters. Theaters have been shut down because nobody goes to them during the lockdowns, and the GameStop was a retail uh, store in a mall, where you actually went in and bought games. And these are gamers. These are young people that love GameStop. That was one of their favorite stores, and it was teetering on bankruptcy. And so it was short selling is where an investor can borrow stock. When you go to invest in the stock market and you go through some broker, so in this case it was called Robinhood, which is sort of ironic because Robinhood didn't come through so well in the end. But anyway, you go to the broker and you sign all this fine print, and probably don't even notice, but the fine print does say that the broker can lend your shares to somebody else. And then so the big investors, like the big hedge funds will go and borrow a bunch of shares and immediately sell them. And the idea is if they sell enough of them, that will drive the price of the stock down, and then they'll buy the shares at the lower price, and they'll make the difference between what they paid to borrow and what they make on the what they have to pay to get the stock back, to give it back to the whoever they borrowed it from. So that's the way short selling works. And theoretically, it's illegal to naked short sell, which means to sell stock you don't have. But the brokers let them do it because they're the middlemen, and I'm not really sure why they let them do it, but it's not heavily regulated. And in this case, they were 140% as many shares had been sold as actually existed. So it was the most heavily short sold stock on the market at that time relative to how many shares there were available to buy. And so it was spotted. Now the question is, who spotted it? And I've seen some articles since that it's not clear, but that it wasn't a big hedge fund that started this whole furor. I mean, originally it was thought that it was one member of the subreddit group who actually is a professional trader, and he works for a company, and it was a violation of his license to be doing this, so he could be in trouble. But then the question is whether the whole group can be in trouble, because they're just doing, you get these newsletters that hype stocks. They say, let's all buy this, or they say we should buy this, or this is a good buy this. They're recommending that all their customers buy this. Well, if you've got 8 million 8 million people in your group and you recommend some stock, then of course that stock's going to go up. So that's what they did. The subreddit group recommended buying GameStop, and so they all piled in and bought GameStop, and the price went up from, it was like below $4 I think a year ago, and it went to well over $400 in January. So it really, really shot up. But apparently there were some big hedge funds, including BlackRock, our favorite hedge fund to not like. Either they saw what was happening and they jumped in as well, or they actually triggered the whole thing. It's not clear who started the whole thing. Some young people made out very well, and they were all excited. Like I saw one person made $20,000, and that was enough to pay off his student loans and pay his rent. But other young people, the ones that buy late or that sell late or whatever, they got burned, and they were complaining as well on the social media. But overall, the feeling seemed to be that the whole point of it was not really to make money on this one bet. It was to save GameStop and to make a point, stick it to the big hedge funds, which they actually did. At least some big hedge funds lost billions of dollars, but there were others that apparently also made a lot of money.
It's interesting to me, and it's really hard to wrap my hand around the idea that you could say borrow someone's car, sell it to someone for 10 grand, and then go and buy it for 3,000 and keep the other 7,000 to yourself. It sounds to me like,
Yeah, that's how it works.
you
That's
know,
what it is. And the person that you borrow it from doesn't even know that you borrowed it. Oh, so the thing that the young people were upset about was that online trading group where they were trading, called Robinhood, had stopped the whole play when the price went up to over $400. I think it was a week ago Wednesday. Then they stopped the whole game, and you couldn't buy anymore, but you could settle your trades. So that meant you could sell, and it meant that the shorters could cover. And so they managed to not lose quite as much money, I guess. Although even buying at that price, they would lose quite a bit. And then the stock dropped a lot because nobody was jumping in and buying and people were selling. It looked like market manipulation right there in favor of the hedge funds. And there were politicians on both sides of the aisle who were said they were going to look at it. So I guess they're going to have hearings, congressional hearings on it. So it's interesting that it was an issue to both Republicans and Democrats, or anyway, representatives on both sides. It wasn't a left-right issue. It's a You could call it a class issue or an insider outsider issue. It's brought the 99% together, and to me what it proves other people are saying what it shows is that the whole system is corrupt and rigged and broken and so forth. But more interesting to me is the fact that it shows that if we all get together and if we have the knowledge, in other words, if we're able to communicate and act together, we, the 99%, are more clearly we outnumber the 1%. It's just a matter of getting together and acting as a group. But then the danger is that we're seeing all this censorship of many things right now, and they're voicing the idea that they will stop these Reddit groups from exchanging information, although it's hard to see how they could do that legally because groups exchange information all the time. It's the virtue of the internet, but then the fear is that they will shut down our access to information to many things. Right now we can't get access to information on things like vaccines. I don't want to tread on forbidden territory, but we can't talk about, election fraud and vaccine, the injuries that are being suppressed. You don't see in the mainstream news all the deaths that have resulted in quite bad side effects that have resulted from these vaccines. They just tout the vaccines, which is rather like a pump and dump scheme. They're pumping the vaccines, and because the drug the pharmaceutical companies are their big advertisers, they can't say anything negative against their advertisers or they'll lose money. So it's all about money and supporting the advertisers who are not necessarily on the side of the people.
So, in many ways, what you point out is the elements of collaboration. When people come together, we can use and revamp systems, or even I would argue we need to recreate our own systems. Perhaps public banking is one of those things we really have to consider as a way to not only protect ourselves from the rapacity of capitalism and the way neoliberalism has affected us, the way that pharmaceuticals are controlling our food supply, the way the Monsanto and vaccines are seem to be working hand in hand these days. We never ask, why is it that our immunity is so compromised? Why is it that we're having so many challenges to fighting a cold, and we're being told that we have to have a flu shot every year, and now that we have a pandemic, we're being told everybody must have this new vaccine that has not even been properly tested. I love that you tread in dangerous territory and things that no one else is talking about, because that's exactly what it takes, right? It takes for us to refuse to be silenced, and to be able to be willing to wander into the unknowns, right? To how does it work? How do we make it work for us, the people? So I wonder, as we come to the end of our interview, if you could talk a little bit about not just the significance of this event, because this has been called a revolution, Occupy Wall Street 2.0, but in terms of our own people's revolution, in terms of our own ability to create systems that support us, be it financial systems, be it, social systems, health focused systems. How do we occupy our own imagination and see and find ways to co-create what we need and to collaborate with others?
Mhm. Well, one thing I was going to mention was that the cartel, or whatever you want to call it, the big boys that work together have, as you point out, they have not just brought down stocks; they've actually brought down whole countries, as they did, for example, with Greece right after the 2008 crash, when they basically manipulate, short sold the currency. The cartel, whoever they are, is quite big and powerful. And the way that these young people have fought back, and the way we can all fight back, is by cooperating, getting together. It's kind of a known way to foment war is to get the people to fight each other. So they've created all these left, right, and racial and different divides that make us think that other people are the problem. But the problem is somewhere else. I mean, what we need to do is to get together and research together, first of all, understand what's going on, and if they censor us or they don't even tell us on the mainstream media, turn off your TV, turn on your computer, find these alternative sources for information, find out what's really going on, and judge for yourself. We don't need to be censored. We need to use our own brains and figure out what's really happening. And we need to organize, get together. I think leaders are good. I mean, apparently it's probably was some leader that planted this idea in the first place in the subreddit group. But we don't want to put all our faith in the ideas of a leader. We need to be, it needs to be a teamwork that we all work on together.
You are so amazing. Thank you so much for your work on writing the book, Web of Debt. I think it's a primer for anyone who wants to understand how the economic system functions. And also to understand the need for us to have our own public banking. It's about time that we surrender this colonial mindset that we have to always have a 1% elite guiding, and distributing crumbs to the rest of the 99% of us, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
what inspires you? What keeps you motivated and doing your part through these times of pandemic and uncertainty?
So this is what I do, but it's very interesting things that are going on, and there's a lot to research, and we are on a cusp. Sources I read say that World Economic Forum and the Great Reset, et cetera, they had to crush the economy. They had to crush our economy and economies globally in order to say this is an opportunity to change the whole system, and then they come in with their new system. But that's also true for changing the system for the benefit of the people. So we too can treat this as an opportunity to understand what's going on, to design a system that actually works for all the people. And so that's what inspires me, is that just the potential that we have right now.
I absolutely love you. Thank you so much for all that you do. And how can people access your work?
My website is ellenbrown.com, and all my articles are there.
We've come to the end of our show, Latin Waves. Latin Waves is an internationally syndicated weekly program made available through campus and community stations and available out to the world at www.latinwavesmedia.com. Visit Latin Waves Media to hear previous shows, to access resources, or support our efforts towards social change via community project engagement.